welcome to the deep dive. We are really incredibly glad you're here with us today.
Absolutely.
Whether you're commuting, prepping for a meeting, or you're just someone who, constantly needs to understand the architecture of how the world actually works, you are in the exact right place.
Yeah, for sure.
Today we are taking on a very specific mission. And I'm going to be honest, right out of the gate, this one is incredibly dense.
That's a lot.
It's alarming. It is going to require us to look at the globe through a really critical, often uncomfortable lens.
Right.
We're unpacking a highly detailed transcript of a recent interview. It's a conversation hosted by Glenn Deason on his YouTube channel, and he's talking with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
And just to give you a sense of the gravity here, Colonel Wilkerson is a 31-year veteran of the United States military.
31 years.
Yeah. He served as a top-level military planner for the U.S. Pacific Command, and crucially, he is the former chief of staff to the U.S. Secretary of State.
So he knows the room.
He was in the room. And the scenario being discussed in this source material, it isn't a retrospective. It's a rapidly unfolding, hypothetical, what they call a Day 5 scenario of a U.S.-backed military conflict with Iran.
A Day 5 scenario.
Right. The transcript details this cascade of events, from the tactical realities on the ground and the arming of Kurdish proxy fighters, all the way to a spiraling global economic crisis.
Okay, so let's unpack this, and this is important. Before we take a single step further, we have to pause and issue a mandatory, really vital disclaimer.
Yeah, we absolutely need to state this clearly.
It is crucial that you understand the parameters of our analysis today. The source material we are dissecting contains highly politically charged content.
Highly charged.
It features incredibly strong opinions, severe accusations, and rhetoric that spans the entire political spectrum. Colonel Wilkerson and the host make these blistering criticisms of both current and former U.S. administrations.
They specifically name Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, Peter Hegseth, and various Biden administration officials.
Right. They also heavily criticize foreign leaders, notably Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
So we need to make this crystal clear right now. We are not taking sides.
Never.
We are not endorsing, validating, or condemning any of the political viewpoints, the religious rhetoric, or the geopolitical ideologies presented in this text.
Right. Our sole job today is to act as an impartial lens. We are here to report, to unpack, and to convey the ideas, claims, and strategic theories exactly as they are contained in the original source material.
We are just examining the architecture of the arguments presented. Nothing more, nothing less.
Exactly. So, with that established, our goal is to look at the variables that dictate global stability. We aren't just looking at the kinetic reality of, how many missiles are fired. We are examining the choke points of the global economy.
The really big picture.
Right. We're looking at the Strait of Hormuz, the silent strategic maneuvering of China, and the battle-hardened posture of Russia.
And we're looking at how a localized conflict supposedly aimed at changing a regime can instantly ripple out and threaten the foundational pillars of the entire 21st century world order.
The stakes here are just profound.
They really are. Because understanding not just what is happening in this scenario, but why it matters to you is essential. We're going to connect these distant geopolitical maneuvers to your everyday economic realities.
From the macro stability of the currency in your bank account to the fragility of global supply chains.
Yeah, it all connects.
So let's start with the foundation the source builds. To understand this hypothetical Day 5 of a war with Iran, Wilkerson insists we have to look back at the ghosts of conflicts past.
You have to know the history.
He brings a massive resume to this discussion, specifically highlighting his time as a military planner for the U.S. Pacific Command. And he makes a very deliberate note here. He says Pacific Command used to feed forces to Central Command,
which he describes as just a tiny little blot on the map back in the day.
Right. So why emphasize that specific shift in the military center of gravity?
Well, what's fascinating here is the evolution of the U.S. military posture that he's outlining. By pointing out that Central Command, which oversees the Middle East, used to be an afterthought compared to the Pacific, he's highlighting a massive strategic pivot that occurred over his career.
A total shift in focus.
Exactly. But more importantly, he's establishing his granular first-hand experience with the region, specifically regarding Iran. He talks about being deeply involved when the Iran-Iraq War started.
And he compares that conflict to World War I in the Levant, right?
He does, in terms of its brutal, grinding trench warfare and just devastating casualties. And he brings up a deeply uncomfortable historical reality of the United States backed Iraq. We backed Saddam Hussein.
Right, and the text really doesn't sugarcoat the nature of that backing. Wilkerson mentions the U.S. supplying chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein to defeat Iran after the 1979 revolution.
He talks about the U.S. eventually entering the naval war in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, he lists specific visceral memories that shaped a generation of military planners. The Bridgerton, a massive oil tanker being hit.
A U.S. warship hitting a mine.
Another U.S. ship limping back to port after Saddam Hussein, who was our ostensible ally at the time, actually fired 2 Exocet missiles at it.
These aren't just historical footnotes. The text frames them as the building blocks of a multi-generational grudge.
And that leads to what Wilkerson describes as the culminating act of that era. It's a tragedy that he argues fundamentally altered the trajectory of U.S.-Iran relations forever.
He details an incident where a U.S. cruiser operating in the sea fired missiles and shot down an Iranian Airbus, a civilian airliner.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, over 290 people on board were killed. According to Wilkerson's assessment, that exact moment was the breaking point. It was the moment the then Ayatollah essentially threw in the towel and accepted a United Nations resolution to end the conflict.
Because the realization in Tehran was that they simply couldn't fight the U.S., which they view as the empire directly in a conventional sense.
Right.
Wait, let me make sure I'm fully grasping the psychological weight of this. Are you saying the trauma of the Airbus incident was so profound that it essentially rewrote the DNA of Iran's entire foreign policy?
Precisely. The argument is that they recognized a head-to-head conventional war was just unwinnable, so they changed the game entirely. And this brings us to a core philosophical point Wilkerson makes.
The Clausewitz reference.
Exactly. He invokes Karl von Clausewitz, the famous Prussian military theorist. Clausewitz is foundational reading for any military strategist. The absolute cardinal rule Wilkerson pulls from Clausewitz is this: anytime you contemplate using the military instrument to turn policy into violence, you absolutely must understand the nature of the conflict you are entering.
You have to understand the nature of your adversary.
You have to. And this is where Wilkerson directs his most blistering critique at current U.S. leadership. He specifically names figures like Marco Rubio, Peter Hegseth, Donald Trump, and various administration spokespeople, arguing that they fundamentally misunderstand Iran's nature.
So how exactly does the source define this nature?
Wilkerson describes a nation deeply rooted in a 3,000-year-old civilization. We're talking about 90 million people, roughly 53% of whom are ethnically Persian. He describes them as being resilient to an absolute fault.
His phrasing is chilling.
It is. He claims they will seal themselves into their very doom just to give the United States a truly vicious headache.
Wow.
They view themselves as embarked on a historical, existential mission against the empire, and according to the text, they will not stop until the last one of them is dead.
That is a staggering level of resolve. It's not just a military posture, it sounds like a cultural and civilizational mandate.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Wilkerson is arguing that conventional deterrence theory falls apart when applied to an adversary operating with that kind of historical memory.
Because when a nation has internalized the use of chemical weapons against its troops, and the loss of a civilian airliner as defining national traumas,
their tolerance for pain becomes exponentially higher than a nation just looking for a quick geopolitical win. The strategic miscalculation happening right now, according to the source, is treating Iran like a fragile, hollow regime that will simply fold under military pressure.
So if conventional deterrence is completely off the table because of that civilizational trauma, it begs the question, what exactly is the U.S. or its allies actually trying to achieve on the ground today? If you know the enemy won't surrender, what's the plan?
Well, the source makes a very bold, highly controversial claim regarding the objectives of U.S. allies, specifically zeroing in on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Okay.
The transcript outlines an argument that Netanyahu's goal in this hypothetical conflict isn't traditional regime change.
Right.
He isn't trying to install a U.S.-friendly puppet government in Tehran that will sell oil and play nice with the West. Wilkerson claims the objective is total, unmitigated chaos.
Chaos as a strategy. That sounds entirely counterintuitive to traditional statecraft.
Wilkerson argues that Netanyahu wants to run rampant over the entire Levant. The goal, as described in the text, is to create a massive zone of destabilization stretching from Turkey all the way down to East Africa.
Effectively destabilizing all the Arab nations caught in between.
Exactly. The logic implies that a fractured, chaotic region is easier to manage or dominate than a region with strong, unified, hostile states.
And the specific tactic the source focuses on to trigger this regional chaos is the arming of Kurdish groups to stoke a civil war within Iran.
Right.
The text mentions efforts to rout out Kurdish fighters, arm them to the teeth, and unleash them as a proxy force. But the source immediately throws up massive red flags about the historical baggage of this strategy.
History provides a very grim precedent here. Wilkerson references the 1991 Iraqi uprising following the Gulf War.
What happened there?
President George H.W. Bush encouraged Iraqis, including the heavily armed Kurdish populations in the north, to rise up against Saddam Hussein. But when they actually did, the geopolitical winds shifted, they were largely abandoned by coalition forces, and they were subsequently slaughtered by Saddam's remaining military.
That's awful.
And Wilkerson points out that a similar, albeit more complex, dynamic played out recently in Syria, where Kurdish groups were utilized as ground forces against ISIS and the Assad regime, only to be left highly vulnerable when U.S. priorities shifted.
So the Kurdish people have this long, deeply tragic history of being utilized as strategic pawns by larger powers.
Yes.
It sounds like tossing a match into a tinderbox.
Yeah.
Because you have 4 distinct countries with massive, concentrated Kurdish populations: Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey.
Yep.
If the U.S. and Israel are deliberately arming Kurds in 3 out of those 4 regions to destabilize Iran, how on earth does Turkey react? Because Turkey is a massive military power, a NATO member, and they possess a deep historic opposition to armed Kurdish groups near their borders.
This raises an important question about the uncontrollable ripple effects of proxy warfare. According to Wilkerson, Turkish President Erdogan is monitoring the situation with extreme alarm.
I would imagine so.
He has deep intelligence assets on the ground. Turkey simply cannot ignore the sudden influx of high-grade weaponry to Kurdish groups, even if those weapons are ostensibly pointed at Tehran.
Because Erdogan's fundamental fear is that those weapons and that militant energy will inevitably turn back toward the Turkish border.
Exactly. And what adds a surreal layer of complexity to this is a diplomatic meeting Wilkerson alleges took place between Netanyahu and Erdogan.
Oh, right. The details of this alleged meeting are wild.
They really are.
The source claims Netanyahu actively tried to convince Erdogan that Turkey's future wasn't with the fractured Arab world, but with Israel. Netanyahu supposedly pitched this grand vision of a new Mediterranean world anchored by Israeli technological dominance, artificial intelligence skills, and capitalist ingenuity.
And he allegedly urged Erdogan to ally with him, dismissing the American empire as a fading, exhausted force and promising Turkey a lucrative place in this new, cutting-edge Mediterranean bloc.
It's an incredibly audacious diplomatic maneuver, if true.
It is. But Wilkerson suggests that while Erdogan might be momentarily tempted by the economic and technological upside, the hard reality of armed Kurdish militias mobilizing on his border is an absolute red line.
Yeah, that's not something he can ignore.
Furthermore, the source notes that Israeli intelligence Mossad is already actively operating in places like Cyprus and southern Greece.
Preparing the regional battlefield.
Exactly, setting up intelligence networks that could eventually box Turkey in strategically. So the notion that Turkey can remain a neutral observer is an illusion. They are deeply involved by sheer geographic and strategic proximity.
Meanwhile, how is Iran reacting to the prospect of armed infiltrators sparking a civil war? You'd think a state facing internal rebellion would be vulnerable, but the text says Iran is uniquely prepared for this exact tactic.
Wilkerson notes that Iran recently acquired a massive shipment of major end-item equipment from Russia. Specifically, they procured advanced Russian attack helicopters.
Why attack helicopters?
Because the evolution of modern warfare has definitively proven that attack helicopters are the absolute optimal weapon system for hunting down and neutralizing irregular state-backed guerrilla forces and border infiltrators.
Oh. And he specifically mentions the British SS alongside these guerrilla forces in the text, right?
Yes. The implication is profound. Iran fully anticipated this proxy warfare strategy. They didn't buy heavy tanks or massive strategic bombers. They bought the precise, localized military hardware required to hunt down light infantry and insurgent groups trying to cross the porous borders from the Persian Gulf or up north near Azerbaijan and Armenia.
So they saw this coming.
Wilkerson's chilling assessment is that of all the contestants in this chaotic theater, Iran has thought out the strategic reality the longest and the best.
Okay, so we have a deliberate strategy of regional chaos, the stoking of proxy civil wars, an adversary that has specifically armed itself to counter that exact move, and neighbors like Turkey who are deeply threatened by the fallout.
Right.
If the plan is to unleash chaos, how capable is the U.S. military of actually managing that chaos on the ground? Because according to the source, the operational reality isn't just difficult, it's a systemic nightmare.
The transcript begins its critique of U.S. tactical execution with a seemingly administrative failure that carries massive, immediate human consequences.
Administrative.
Yeah, Wilkerson points to the total failure of non-combatant evacuation operations, or NEO. He explicitly calls out current Secretary of State Marco Rubio, alongside his predecessors, for allegedly failing to utilize what are known in the State Department as F-77 forms.
Okay, for the listener, what exactly is an F-77 form and why is it so critical?
It's the foundational document for civilian safety in a foreign country. It logs every American citizen, their name, passport details, local address, emergency contacts. It's the master list required to orchestrate a mass evacuation if a country suddenly descends into war.
And the source claims these forms simply weren't used. The U.S. made no effort to quietly evacuate its citizens before the hypothetical conflict escalated.
None.
But the deeply cynical part is why Wilkerson suspects this happened. He argues that if it wasn't just crash stupidity or bureaucratic incompetence, it was likely a deliberate strategic choice to avoid tipping off Iranian intelligence.
The logic being, if the Iranians saw a massive, coordinated, non-combatant evacuation operation unfolding, chartered flights, embassy personnel moving south, they would know instantly that a preemptive American attack was imminent.
Wow. The horrific result of that decision, according to the text, is that you now have thousands of American citizens stranded in an active, high-intensity war zone.
The commercial airports are shuttered, the airspace is contested, and the potential for massive civilian casualties among Americans is exceptionally high.
It's a stark example of how grand, abstract, strategic maneuvering can completely override basic operational responsibilities to a nation's own citizens.
Absolutely. But the tactical vulnerabilities described in the source go way beyond civilian evacuation logistics. There is a severe systemic issue with the actual machinery of war, specifically munitions.
Right.
The source mentions that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff allegedly registered formal objections to this entire operation based entirely on critical munition shortages, specifically air defense missiles. And this vulnerability is illustrated with a devastating anecdote about an Iranian strike on Bahrain.
Yes, and this is where the logistics of modern warfare become fascinating and terrifying. Bahrain is home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters. It is the absolute beating heart of U.S. naval power projection in the Middle East. And the text says Iran executed a precision strike on it.
But it's what they hit that is so critical. According to Wilkerson, the strike didn't just cause random kinetic damage to the base. It specifically targeted and destroyed the vertical missile launcher loading apparatus, the specialized crane.
Wait, a crane? Why is a crane a single point of failure for the most powerful navy on Earth?
Because modern naval combatants destroyers and cruisers rely on vertical launch systems, or VLS, to fire their Tomahawk missiles and air defense interceptors. These missiles are massive, heavily explosive, multi-ton canisters.
You can't just slide them in by hand.
Exactly. You cannot reload those VLS cells by hand, and you certainly can't reload them while bobbing in the open ocean. It requires highly specialized, heavy-duty, perfectly calibrated cranes situated in calm, deep-water harbors to meticulously lower the new munitions into the ship's deck.
So if you blow up that specific crane at the Fifth Fleet headquarters, what happens to those multi-billion-dollar U.S. warships when they empty their magazines?
According to the source, they are effectively rendered impotent. They have to turn around and make a massive, immensely time-consuming journey out of the combat theater, sailing thousands of miles to Diego Garcia, an island base deep in the Indian Ocean, just to find a functional crane to reload.
Oh my God.
That effectively removes a warship from the theater of combat for weeks. It's a tactical masterstroke by the adversary that highlights a glaring, fragile logistical bottleneck for the U.S. Navy.
It paints a picture of an adversary that intimately understands U.S. operational dependencies. And this leads Wilkerson to aggressively mock the idea of the U.S. putting ground troops into Iran to stabilize the situation.
Yeah, he uses a historical comparison to explain the sheer scale of the impossibility. He notes that at the end of World War II, the U.S. and its allies put roughly 12 million men into Germany and Japan to occupy and pacify them.
12 million.
And those were countries with populations around 70 million at the time, and occupying them required a colossal society-wide mobilization that touched every family in America.
Now compare that to the geography of Iran. We're talking about a country of 90 million people, a landmass significantly larger, vastly more mountainous, and geographically hostile than Iraq or Afghanistan. Wilkerson states that even if the U.S. could somehow scrape together an invasion force of 400,000 to 500,000 troops, which he highly doubts is even mathematically possible, given current recruitment crises and hollowed-out reserve levels, that entire force would simply disappear.
They would be swallowed up within 5 years, lost in the Zagros Mountains, and consumed by a hostile, deeply cohesive population waging an asymmetric insurgency.
And this realization of profound military overextension doesn't happen in a vacuum. It creates a massive domino effect among U.S. allies globally.
The text highlights a terrifying dynamic regarding high-end air defense systems like Takara and Patriot missile batteries. Because of the critical shortages in the Middle East, the U.S. is reportedly discussing pulling these essential defensive systems out of South Korea to send them to the Iranian theater.
Imagine being the South Korean government in that scenario. You're sitting across the DMZ from a nuclear-armed, highly unpredictable North Korea. You have structured your entire national defense around the U.S. security umbrella, and suddenly your primary high-altitude defense systems are being packed up and shipped to the Middle East to fight a war you have nothing to do with.
The source argues this fundamentally destroys an ally's faith in American security guarantees. South Korea is allegedly debating every single day in closed-door, high-level intelligence rooms whether they even want to remain in the U.S. alliance.
They're reconsidering everything.
They are coming to the stark realization that the U.S. military presence on their peninsula isn't actually there to protect Seoul, it's there to posture against China.
And Wilkerson makes a very grim prediction here. He says the U.S. is going to lose the alliance with South Korea entirely within 24 months, and this Middle Eastern conflict is just the catalyst that sped up the timeline.
Because South Korea has a massive, complex economic relationship with China, they have absolutely zero desire to be dragged into a catastrophic Pacific war with China simply because they host U.S. bases.
When an empire is forced to strip critical defenses from one vital ally just to plug a leaking hole in another part of the world, the entire global architecture of alliances begins to fracture. The perception of infinite U.S. military bandwidth is shattered.
It really is.
Which brings us to a terrifying realization. If the military reality is this dire, and the geopolitical alliances are already cracking, what happens when this conflict spills over from military bases and missile silos straight into the global supply chain?
This is where things get really bleak.
The source pivots hard here, focusing on oil, the vulnerability of emerging markets like India, and the most critical maritime choke point on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, the source material shifts from analyzing military tactics to outlining sheer systemic economic terror. The primary case study Wilkerson uses is India.
Okay, why India?
India is portrayed as being incredibly, perhaps fatally vulnerable to this specific conflict. The text states that roughly 60% of India's oil comes directly through the Strait of Hormuz.
60%.
And currently, they operate with only a 25-day strategic reserve on hand. To make matters worse, as the conflict spikes energy markets, India urgently needs to raise $15 billion immediately just to afford oil at its current elevated prices to keep their domestic economy from freezing.
And the host of the interview, Glenn Deason, brings up an incredibly ironic contradiction here. He notes that the U.S. spent a massive amount of time, diplomatic pressure, and political capital trying to convince India not to buy cheap Russian oil following the invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
Now, in the face of this Middle Eastern crisis, the U.S. probably wishes India had bought more, because the alternative is an outright economic catastrophe for the subcontinent.
And Wilkerson expands on the magnitude of this threat by detailing a highly classified-sounding war games simulation he participated in over in Beijing.
Tell me about this simulation.
This simulation is one of the most chilling parts of the entire transcript. He describes a massive tabletop exercise attended by Chinese, Japanese, and European officials, importantly alongside risk assessors and representatives from major maritime insurers like Lloyd's of London.
Wait, why is the presence of Lloyd's of London so significant in a military war game?
Because they insure the massive supertankers that move the world's energy. If Lloyd's decides the Strait of Hormuz is too dangerous, they pull the insurance.
And if the ships aren't insured, they don't sail.
Exactly. In this simulation, they modeled exactly what would happen if the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Hormuz were blocked, or if major Saudi production facilities were taken offline by Iranian retaliation. The result of the simulation was apocalyptic. The price of oil skyrocketed past $200 a barrel.
A geopolitical chess move thousands of miles away instantly translates to a massive systemic shock. We aren't just talking about inflation. We are talking about emerging markets facing sovereign default because their dollar-denominated energy imports suddenly outstrip their foreign currency reserves.
Exactly. And in that Beijing simulation, the crisis was only mitigated because of what Wilkerson calls a cooperative spirit.
What does he mean by that?
He describes how Chinese officials were so alarmed by the economic modeling of the simulation that they literally paused the game to consult their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The global players eventually worked together to radically reroute global energy flows, shifting supplies away from China toward Korea, diverting Alaskan oil toward Russia, sacrificing national advantages just to keep the global macroeconomic system from flatlining.
But, and this is the terrifying caveat Wilkerson adds, that cooperative spirit simply no longer exists. Today's geopolitical climate is entirely fractured.
If the Strait of Hormuz gets shut down today, there will be no collaborative international effort to share the pain and carefully reroute resources. It will be a brutal, zero-sum, every nation for itself scramble to secure energy.
So what happens?
Wilkerson bluntly states that in such a scenario, leaders like Vladimir Putin will make an absolute windfall profit on their energy resources, while leaders like India's Narendra Modi will be looking at disastrous domestic collapse.
This brings us to the domestic U.S. preparation for such a massive economic shock. Specifically, the state of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Right, the SPR.
The source levels a very heavy accusation at Donald Trump here. It claims that Trump made explicit promises, starting in his first administration and continuing into his campaigns, to fill the reserve to massive levels. Wilkerson cites figures between 500 million and 1 billion barrels, which the national security state deems essential to weather a prolonged Hormuz closure.
But according to Wilkerson's claim, Trump didn't put a penny or a single gallon into it when oil was cheap, leaving the reserve sitting at roughly 415 million barrels. The consequence of that inaction, as outlined in the text, is that the U.S. economy is dangerously exposed. If a massive supply shock hits tomorrow, the U.S. might be forced to undertake wildly costly emergency domestic production measures just to survive, all because the strategic buffer wasn't filled when the opportunity existed.
So we have a situation where the military is overextended, critical alliances are fraying, and the global economy is teetering on the edge of a $200 a barrel abyss. When the tangible, on-the-ground reality is this bleak, how do leaders actually justify the spiraling situation to their public?
That's the real question.
This leads us directly into what the source describes as narrative whiplash and the deeply alarming rise of holy war rhetoric.
Narrative whiplash is the perfect term. The source highlights incredible, glaring contradictions in how this hypothetical war is being sold, contrasting the stated diplomatic goals with the kinetic reality.
For example,
On one hand, the dominant Western narrative is that the U.S. is intervening to help Iranian protesters achieve freedom from a brutal, oppressive theocracy. But simultaneously, Deason and Wilkerson note that the U.S. and Israel are actively bombing the very infrastructure those civilians rely on to survive: airports, power grids, schools, hospitals, and civilian residences.
the transcript points out the morbid, dark irony of the humanitarian justification. It's the classic paradox of modern intervention. We have to burn the country to the ground in order to save it.
Exactly.
But the contradictions get even sharper, almost absurd, when the source discusses the nuclear justification for the conflict. The stated paramount goal is often to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon.
Deason breaks down the deep hypocrisy of this setup based on the geopolitical facts on the ground. You have the United States, an avowed global nuclear superpower, and Israel, which the source explicitly describes as an illegal nuclear power operating entirely outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. These two nuclear-armed states are attacking Iran. Meanwhile, Iran is a non-nuclear state that actually signed the NPT and had previously agreed to incredibly intrusive IAEA inspections for transparency.
It's two nuclear-armed nations bombing a non-nuclear nation to prevent a weapons program that, ironically, U.S. intelligence agencies have previously stated didn't even exist in a weaponized form.
The narrative confusion deepens further when Wilkerson brings up Trump's past actions and public statements. He notes that Trump claims to have already obliterated Iran's nuclear program with B-2 stealth bombers during previous escalations.
But wait.
Yet, paradoxically, the White House issues aggressive press releases, calling anyone who says the program isn't obliterated a purveyor of fake news.
So the administration is simultaneously claiming the existential threat is completely destroyed while using the existence of that very same threat to justify ongoing massive military conflict.
It makes no sense.
The press interactions described in the source sound like utter chaos.
Hmm.
Deason mentioned Speaker of the House Mike Johnson giving a speech where he claims Iran started the war by declaring war on the U.S., specifically citing attacks on sovereign American embassies in Saudi Arabia.
Yet, in the same breath, the U.S. is bombing sovereign Iranian territory, but refusing to officially declare it a war, hiding behind sanitized terms like special operation or kinetic strikes.
And Wilkerson also highlights Senator Marco Rubio's disastrous interactions with the White House press corps.
Oh, yeah.
He describes Rubio getting completely flabbergasted by reporters who continually point out the logical inconsistencies of the administration's stance. For example, the circular argument that the U.S. had to preemptively attack Iran because Iran was inevitably going to attack the U.S. after Israel attacked Iran.
Right, and when pressed on this logical knot, Wilkerson describes Rubio essentially short-circuiting, abruptly picking and choosing compliant reporters to avoid answering the hard foundational questions.
The overarching point the source makes here is about narrative discipline. Unlike the buildup to the Iraq War, which, despite being based on flawed intelligence, had a highly unified, disciplined, repetitive narrative about weapons of mass destruction.
This conflict features completely contradictory narratives that change depending on which official is speaking on any given day.
This raises an important question, and it's where the deep dive takes a truly alarming turn into domestic rhetoric. Because when the geopolitical logic fails, when the tactical reality is grim and the economic costs are soaring, the source claims the political rhetoric shifts away from statecraft and directly into religious extremism.
What happens when politicians abandon international law and start framing a geopolitical conflict as a divine mandate?
It gets scary.
The transcript points to very specific, high-profile figures to illustrate this dangerous shift. It cites former Ambassador Mike Huckabee giving an interview to Tucker Carlson where he essentially claims that Israel has the absolute right to take over half the Middle East simply because God gave it to them.
Just bypassing everything else.
Exactly. It's a justification rooted entirely in theology, completely bypassing international law, treaties, or human rights conventions.
And it goes even further into apocalyptic territory. Wilkerson explicitly calls out Pastor John Hagee, the highly influential head of Christians United for Israel. He describes Hagee preaching to his massive, politically active audience that this conflict is a literal, biblical, holy war.
Hagee is quoted as telling his followers that they are on the righteous side, that they are modern-day crusaders helping to bring about Armageddon and the prophesied return of Jesus Christ.
Wilkerson points out a dark irony here. While this eschatological rhetoric makes him physically ill as a military professional, Hagee is at least telling the truth about his underlying motivations, unlike the politicians in Washington who lie about grand strategy and human rights.
But this religious rhetoric isn't just for public consumption on Sunday mornings, is it? According to the text, it has profound, immediate, institutional implications for the United States. And this brings us to perhaps the most severe, shocking allegation in the entire transcript.
What's that?
Wilkerson claims that Peter Hegseth is actively restructuring the domestic U.S. military based on these extreme ideological lines.
Wait, restructuring the military?
Yes, the text alleges that Hegseth is conducting ideological vetting of the military ranks, penetrating both the upper echelon of command and the rank-and-file level. Wilkerson claims Hegseth recently dismissed a 3-star Navy admiral who served as the director of the Joint Staff, implying the dismissal was politically or ideologically motivated.
That's huge.
Furthermore, he alleges that Hegseth is actively encouraging soldiers to take personal oaths to God and Jesus rather than their constitutional oath to defend the United States Constitution.
A shift from constitutional oaths to religious oaths within the world's most powerful military. What is the stated purpose for this kind of ideological vetting, according to Wilkerson?
Wilkerson's assessment is deeply alarming. He speculates that the ultimate goal is to ensure the military's absolute compliance during future domestic political crises. He argues that Hegseth is deliberately building a military apparatus that will not stand on the sidelines, neutral and loyal to the Constitution, if another event like January 6th occurs.
The text explicitly claims the goal is to have a military ready to support potential power grabs by Trump, whether that means a full-fledged executive coup, the invocation of the Insurrection Act against domestic protesters, or even extreme scenarios like canceling midterm elections.
And we really need to remind you, the listener, that these are the intense, severe claims and speculations made by Colonel Wilkerson in the source material. We are impartially reporting his worldview.
Absolutely. Looking at the architecture of his argument, Wilkerson is connecting two massive destabilizing trends. the collapse of a coherent, rational foreign policy narrative abroad, and the deliberate rise of extreme, religiously motivated domestic rhetoric at home.
He believes they're symbiotic, designed to secure absolute power domestically while intentionally allowing chaos to reign internationally.
Which begs the ultimate trillion-dollar question: who actually benefits from this? When the U.S. is bogged down in contradictory narratives, religious proxy wars, and an unwinnable Middle Eastern quagmire, who is winning?
That is the critical pivot to the final major theme of the text, the ultimate beneficiaries, the rise of China and Russia. Wilkerson argues that if you step back from the tactical noise of Iran and Israel, the missile strikes, the proxy skirmishes, you see a much larger, much quieter, and vastly more consequential game being played on the global chessboard.
And the evidence begins with high-level diplomacy.
The source highlights a massive diplomatic shift. Russia and China didn't just sign standard bilateral trade agreements with Iran, they signed a formal trilateral defense pact.
That is a massive signal to the world. It tells everyone in Washington, London, and Brussels that Moscow and Beijing are deeply militarily invested in whatever happens to Tehran.
Some Western analysts suggest that the entire U.S. operation in the Middle East is actually a brilliant backdoor way to damage China and Russia, masking the true intent behind the facade of degrading Iran's nuclear program.
But Wilkerson vehemently disagrees with that assessment.
Totally. He doesn't see a multi-layered 4D chess U.S. strategy orchestrated by astute geopolitical players. He just sees reactionary chaos.
However, he firmly believes that China and Russia are the ultimate beneficiaries of this American chaos, even if they aren't firing the missiles themselves. And the threat from China, as detailed in the source, isn't primarily military, it is fundamentally financial. It strikes the very heart of American global hegemony.
This is where we get to the written mandate from Chinese President Xi Jinping. Wilkerson reveals that he had a specific, highly consequential document translated by Chaz Freeman, a highly respected former diplomat and fluent Mandarin speaker, to ensure absolute accuracy regarding the nuance.
What does the document say?
In this mandate, Xi Jinping acknowledges an objective reality. China is currently supreme in almost every global category: industrial manufacturing, capitalist expansion, technological integration, and regional military projection. But he admits they're not yet paramount in one specific foundational area: global finance.
And the mandate outlines the solution. Xi Jinping reportedly states, "I'm going to put the renminbi forward as the world's new transactional reserve currency, a replacement for the dollar."
Now, previous Chinese leaders, like Deng Xiaoping, strictly avoided this. They knew how violently destabilizing it would be to the global system to directly challenge the U.S. dollar's supremacy.
But according to the source, Xi is now putting it in writing. The era of biding time and hiding strength is over. He is ready for the fight to dethrone the petrodollar.
And this is crucial to understanding Chinese strategy. He doesn't want to fight that war with blood, bombers, or nuclear weapons. He wants to win it indirectly, employing a classic Sun Tzu approach.
He wants the U.S. to exhaust its treasury, alienate its allies, and bleed its military readiness in places like the Zagros Mountains, while China quietly builds alternative financial architecture like the BRICS payment systems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
However, the source warns that if the U.S. pushes too hard, if Xi figures out that the chaos in the Middle East is specifically designed by Washington to block his Belt and Road Initiative and sever his vital trade routes to Europe and Africa, China will throw its weight into the conflict militarily.
And if they do, Wilkerson argues the U.S. is completely outmatched in a very specific, highly lethal arena.
That arena is the Arabian Sea. Wilkerson provides a fascinating, highly technical breakdown of why this specific body of water is an absolute nightmare for the U.S. Navy. He explains that the Arabian Sea possesses unique oceanographic properties, specifically deep convection zones and extreme layered salinity levels.
Why does salinity matter to a multi-billion-dollar warship?
Because it fundamentally distorts underwater acoustics. Those varying layers of salt and temperature bend sound waves. Wilkerson explains that in the Arabian Sea, both passive and active sonar become effectively useless. The sound waves simply don't travel normally, they bounce off the thermal layers, creating massive acoustic shadow zones.
Wow. So because of that specific water density, Wilkerson says a top-of-the-line Chinese diesel-electric submarine could sit just 100 meters away from a top-tier U.S. nuclear submarine, and neither would have any idea the other was there.
And this is where the technological nuance is critical. People assume nuclear submarines are always better, but nuclear subs have to constantly run massive coolant pumps to keep their reactors from melting down, which creates noise. China has invested heavily in slow, incredibly quiet diesel-electric subs.
When they run on battery power, they are essentially silent holes in the water.
Furthermore, they are equipped with advanced torpedoes that don't even leave a wake on the surface. They can sink an aircraft carrier without anyone ever knowing where the shot came from.
Wilkerson is unequivocal here. He states that Russia and China, working in tandem, could take care of every single U.S. combatant in the Arabian Sea just using these silent submarines. He says it's a real naval war that the U.S. would definitively catastrophically lose.
To drive the point home, he compares the lethality of submarines to the Pacific theater in World War II. He points out that despite the historical fame of the aircraft carriers at Midway, it was actually U.S. submarines with their massive 10,000-mile patrols that devastated Japanese commercial shipping and successfully isolated the island nation, starving their war machine.
Submarines, he argues, remain the ultimate, undeniable apex predator of naval warfare.
And while China threatens the seas and the foundations of the global financial system, Russia is looming massively on the landmass. The source shifts to an assessment of the Russian military that is profoundly sobering, completely contradicting the popular Western narrative of a weak, depleted Russian force.
Wilkerson says that the Russian army that clumsily started the special military operation in Ukraine years ago is absolutely not the army that exists today. Through the brutal, grinding crucible of that conflict, they have evolved.
They have mastered modern drone warfare, electronic countermeasures, and adapted their infantry tactics to survive against high-end NATO weaponry.
His assessment is that the Russian army is now the most battle-hardened, technologically integrated, and deadly land army on the face of the earth. To contextualize this fear, he reaches back to 1865.
Yeah, he describes how European military observers from Britain, France, Prussia watched the U.S. Union Army at the end of the Civil War. They saw a million-man, battle-hardened force that had mastered the brutal logistics of total war at places like Gettysburg and Cold Harbor.
Those European observers sent terrified, urgent messages back to their capitals saying, "Beware, they will be after you next." The Union Army was an unstoppable juggernaut compared to the ceremonial armies of Europe.
Wilkerson is saying that Russia holds that exact same terrifying position today relative to NATO's ground forces. He warns that the U.S. and its allies shouldn't be messing around trying to run intelligence operations or destabilize places like Georgia, Moldova, or Armenia right now because the Russian military is simply too competent, too lethal, and too experienced.
And Deason points out that a decisive Russian victory in Ukraine would send a chilling, unmistakable message to any divided society considering moving toward the Western sphere or NATO. This connects directly to a reported conversation the source mentions with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
Lavrov stated explicitly that Russia's primary, unalterable concern is NATO moving eastward. And the warning is clear: anywhere NATO attempts to move east, Russia will check it with overwhelming force. The conflict in Ukraine is just the most obvious, bloody example of this doctrine in action.
We've covered massive ground today. We have journeyed through an incredibly dense, staggering landscape painted by the source material. We started by looking at the deep, multi-generational scars of the Iranian people, a 3,000-year-old civilization holding a fierce grudge forged by the trauma of chemical weapons and a downed civilian airliner.
We examined the terrifying tactical realities of a hollowed-out military apparatus. Missing F-77 evacuation forms abandoning citizens, empty missile cranes in Bahrain crippling the Navy, and the geographical absurdity of putting ground troops into a mountainous country of 90 million people.
We moved from the battlefield to the global boardroom, staring down the economic specter of $200 a barrel oil, the sovereign vulnerability of nations like India, and the exposure of a depleted U.S. strategic petroleum reserve.
We unpacked the narrative whiplash, the grotesque contradictions of bombing hospitals to save civilians, and the deeply alarming rise of domestic religious rhetoric designed to ensure military compliance during political crises.
And finally, we saw how this localized chaos in the Middle East serves as the perfect smokescreen for the ultimate beneficiaries: a battle-hardened Russia checking NATO expansion, and a financially ambitious China waiting in the silent depths of the Arabian Sea to dethrone the dollar.
The core theme woven through every single page of this transcript is undeniable. This source paints a picture of a superpower that fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the conflicts it is entering.
And in doing so, it is inadvertently accelerating the rise of its greatest rivals, draining its own munitions, fracturing its vital alliances, and exposing its own citizens to massive economic pain.
And this is exactly why diving deep into these dense, uncomfortable sources matters to you. In an era where you are bombarded by information overload, algorithmically driven news cycles, and contradictory political narratives, the real truth is often buried beneath the noise.
Peeling back the layers of strategic, historical, and economic realities, looking past the polished press releases, and examining the logistics of VLS cranes, the supply chains of global energy, and the quiet financial decrees of Xi Jinping, is the only way to truly understand the architecture of the world you are navigating.
Absolutely.
We want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We've talked extensively about missiles, proxy armies, and silent submarines. But if the ultimate strategy of rival powers like China is to defeat the empire using a Sun Tzu approach, meaning they want to win without firing a single missile directly at the U.S. homeland, using the U.S.'s own military overextension and foreign policy chaos to quietly dethrone the dollar in the background.
Could it be that the kinetic, explosive conflicts dominating our screens every night are actually just the noisy distractions?
Are the bombs, the aircraft carriers, and the extreme political rhetoric just the loud cover hiding the true silent war being fought right now for the 21st century's financial future?
It is a profound question that completely reframes how you will watch the evening news from now on.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly intense, illuminating journey today. Keep questioning the narratives, keep digging into the mechanics of the world, and we will see you on the next deep dive.